Hi, this is Guy Wallace. I started in learning and development way back in 1979, and I semi-retired in 2023. But my current mission as a semi-retired L&D professional is to help enterprise learning and development organizations become more performance-based. Welcome to my podcast. This episode is about using formal project steering teams and formal gate review meetings in your ISD or LXD projects. Now, before I start, this is how I went about conducting my projects as a consultant. That was my context. Your context is likely different. Perhaps there are some things in this podcast that you can embrace and adopt and use as is, or maybe adapt them and modify them in some way to help them fit your situation, your context. Let's see. Way back on November 1st, 1982, I left my job as a training project supervisor at MTech, Motorola's Training and Education Center, the forerunner of Motorola University. I had only been there 16 months. But I joined a small consulting firm that my second wife had joined 9 months earlier. I went to work for Ray Svensson as a subcontractor for tax purposes, but I was almost really an employee. The director of MTech had actually put my wife and Ray together, and she had joined him as the third person of his two-person organization. When I joined, I was the third of 3 consultants, and we had an office manager and 1 support staff member to do our word processing. I was asked by Ray to start a training practice area. He had hired me because I had taken his notion of a curriculum architecture that I had heard him speak about when he spoke to us on the MTech staff, and I did one then for manufacturing supervisors at 30-plus sites across 5 business sectors across all of North America. Ray had been doing consulting work on strategic planning for training and development for Bill Wiggenhorn, the MTech director. The notion of a curriculum architecture had first been proposed by the information technology management clients, the IT people, back at the Bell Systems Center for Technical Education, where Ray had worked doing strategic planning before he became an independent consultant years earlier. I was the first person to actually do something that had been discussed for years at the Bell Systems Center for Technical Education, where they were responsible for training 50,000 engineers every year for the Bell operating companies across the USA. My role as a consultant was one where I intended to bid my instructional systems design projects, which for the most part were curriculum architecture or instructional architecture projects, and then there were also instructional development projects. But my intent was to do these fixed fee with a hard schedule. So I really needed to define my processes and methods at a pretty granular level. The process for curriculum architecture or instructional architecture is ADDIE-like, although no new content is produced in those projects. The performance-based needs are determined, existing content is assessed for its fit into the architecture and the training and development or learning and development paths that are produced, and gaps in the architecture and paths are identified so they can be prioritized for build or buy efforts. In order to control the project schedule, I needed to lock down the resources and get them scheduled. I needed to find ways to engage all of the key stakeholders who held all of these resources. They reported to them. In order to control the project schedule, I needed to lock down the resources and get them scheduled. I needed to find a way to engage all of the key stakeholders who held all of these resources as they reported up to the stakeholders. And I need to make sure that they agreed that this project should be done in the first place. Otherwise, I asked them to kill it, which was kind of unique, a consultant asking the clients to kill the consultant's projects. Doesn't happen very often, does it? But if we were to go ahead, I needed to sell them on the project plan details and the schedule and lock down that schedule and the people that reported to them that needed to participate in the project. Of course, I and whoever else was involved in the project had to deliver everything on time with my estimated and budget hours, which were reflected in my fixed fee pricing. Now, I borrowed the concept of a gate review meeting from what I had learned at Motorola from the TQM, the Total Quality Management people that I was working with when I was serving manufacturing, materials, and purchasing functions across all of Motorola's North American operations. I also needed to get my client, who had hired us, to enlist his or her internal clients or customers, whom I was calling stakeholders, to get involved with the project starting on day one. I called that group the Project Steering Team, and I told them in my initial meetings with them that I was giving them a command and control mechanism in order to ensure that this project that we were going to do for them, if they approved it, would serve their needs and help improve or sustain the performance of their people working in their processes that then should be reflected in their numbers, the metrics that they were being held to. They generally liked hearing that, but then I would throw in the kicker, that of course this gave me an empowerment mechanism as I was now doing the project on their behalf. They also liked to hear that. So I would meet with them in the very first meeting, and I would tell them as we started that they had 4 options to decide when we were done with the meeting. Option 1 was to kill the project because it just didn't make any business sense to them. My clients hated that I would lead with that, and some would beg me to make that the 4th option and not the first option, and I did it on occasion. But most of the time I stuck to my guns and said no. They needed to know that we're serious about this being business-oriented, and their number 1 option needs to be kill it if it doesn't make any business sense. Option 2 was to take a look at the project plan and amend it in some way because it just didn't fit their culture or their resources availability. Generally, we were talking about whether we were going to conduct the project using more traditional methods for analysis and design, which meant doing analysis, doing traditional interviews and observations and document reviews, and in design it would mean me producing the design all by myself and then bringing it back to them for their review. The alternative to the traditional approach was to do what I called a facilitated group process, where we would assemble a team of 8 to 12 people that usually included master performers for what we were going to be focusing on performance-wise, plus other subject matter experts as needed. And sometimes we would even include supervisors of the target audiences, and sometimes we would include relatively new people from the target audience who had shown some promise to the members of the project steering team. Those people would lend the voice of the new hire to the project to make sure that what we were producing was going to meet the needs of the people coming on board now. Because most of the time, master performers and other subject matter experts are the wizened old pros who have 10, 20 years of experience. And let's face it, they are pretty much clueless when it comes to what it's like to be a new person coming on board now into the job that we are focused on. The third option for the project steering team was to defer the project because it's just not timely for some reason and other things need to occur before we should get started. This might be the case if there's some reorganization going on, a changing of their processes, or some significant tool set, and we should wait until the dust settles on that before we proceed. The fourth option is to approve the project plan as it is and resource it, and then let's get going. That would require that we talk about the master performers and the other subject matter experts that need to be assigned to the project. Those assignments included participation in an analysis team meeting or in the analysis effort, doing individual interviews and observations, etc. The design team meeting or design effort was the same thing. And if we're doing instructional development versus instructional architecture projects, we would need the human resources to develop the content, and those would include master performers and other subject matter experts. Plus, I would need people to help me do the alpha testing and the beta testing, and then the pilot testing. And we'll get back to pilot testing a little bit later. When we started talking about the master performers, I would tell them that this is where they were strategically placing their bets. as I told them, I need your best people. If it doesn't hurt your operation to give them to me for the 2 or 3 or 4 days analysis meeting, or the 2 or 3 or 4 day design meeting, then you've probably given me some ringers, some people who won't really contribute the worthy inputs that I need in order to produce worthy outputs. If we're to produce stellar instruction, that will really help to develop the learners so that they can perform better back on the job. Then we need the best inputs. Garbage in, garbage out, good stuff in, good stuff out. Well, that was in the first gate review meeting with the project steering team. I generally met with the project steering teams in 4 formal gate review meetings. The first one was at the end of the first phase, which was always project planning and kickoff. That phase was inclusive of the entire intake process, the development of a project plan draft, and then the finalization of the project plan with the project steering team so that they would own it. And then they could make changes to it if necessary, or defer the whole project, or to kill it. After all, it's not the training organization's project, or my project as the consultant. It was the stakeholders' project. We're doing this for them, and either they want to step up to the requirements for that or not. If I would pass the gate, so to speak, then I'd go conduct the analysis using either the group-facilitated process or the traditional route, and then I'd write up an analysis report and bring it to the second gate review meeting at the end of the analysis phase. The project steering team would have those same 4 options: kill it, modify it, defer it, or let's resource it and get going. The third gate review meeting with the project steering team would be at the end of the design phase, where I would review the design with them. But let me step back to the second gate review meeting at the end of the analysis phase. At that point, I would be able to forecast to the project steering team what I was going to push for in the design process, in the design meeting, and see if the master performers and other subject matter experts assigned to that meeting would concur, would go along with my proposals, or whether they would push back and want to see certain changes from the analysis data that was going to be used in the design meeting. I would also talk to the project steering team about my bias towards producing performance guides versus learning experiences, where we don't want to expect people to memorize everything. We just need to give them some guidance that they can use on the job, and if they use it often enough, they'll memorize it, and if they use it randomly, occasionally, we can't expect that they'll memorize this, so we need to give them some guidance, some job aids, performance guides, quick reference guides, etc. I was going to then, in the learning experience, teach people how to use the performance guides and let them use them in the practice with feedback sessions. I would have also have told the project steering team in the analysis gate review meeting that I was going to make their learning experience approximately 60% practice with feedback, and that we would do several rounds of practice with feedback on the key task sets that produced the most critical outputs. This was sometimes controversial, as that was seldom the way training or instruction or learning was constructed and deployed from their experiences. It's also in those first few gate review meetings where I would begin to worry out loud about transfer, and I would tell them that the learning and development function has very little control over transfer, but they, the stakeholders, they have the control, as the entire change of management from the target audiences up to them reports to them. And so if this project is worthy of doing, then they needed to take responsibility for transfer. They need to communicate their expectations, they need to inspect for it, they need to provide consequences for it happening, and consequences when it doesn't happen. That was also at times controversial. People are used to expecting the learning and development function to be responsible for transfer, but that's ridiculous. The fourth gate review meeting that I would have with the project steering team was either to review the estimated costs and the implementation for an entire architecture where we had identified what was needed, what was available, and what the gaps were so that they could be prioritized. They would prioritize the gaps as high, medium, low, or zero. And if they were designated as zero, that meant that they would remain unstructured OJT, which later became known as informal learning. But it was a way for the client, the stakeholders, to designate which content should never see another nickel's worth of investment by the learning and development function. You could tag it and be done with it and not worry about somebody spending money and time and effort to create content that was really of low value to the stakeholders. If the project was for instructional development, that fourth gate review meeting would follow the full destructive pilot testing efforts, and we would read out the results of the pilot test and share our revision recommendations. Sometimes the pilot results and feedback from the participants said to do something, and we would agree. At other times, we would disagree, and we would give our reasons to the project steering team and then let them make the business decision as to what we should do. We would take those revision recommendations, and by the end of that meeting, we would have the revision specifications that would be used in the final phase of the project, where we would update the content and then either repilot it if the project steering team wanted us to, or we would simply load it into the LMS and get ready for the deployment, doing train-the-trainer sessions or whatever was appropriate given the form of the instruction. Back to pilot testing. In the very first gate review meeting, when I discussed the resources needed for the project, when I got to the pilot testing efforts, I explained that I needed two different types of people. I needed target audience representatives so that we could measure learning pre and post the pilot test. We needed to see, did we help people develop some competence in line with what we were wanting? Either we did or we didn't. The second group that I needed were additional master performers and other subject matter experts who had not been involved in the project at that point, as I didn't want people who were previously involved because they would be biased to like what they had helped produce. But I needed this group of additional master performers and other subject matter experts so that I could determine whether the instructional content that we produced was accurate, complete, and appropriate. Target audience representatives wouldn't necessarily know what was accurate, complete, and appropriate, so you can't rely on them to tell you. And we can't measure learning with a group of master performers and other subject matter experts who theoretically already know it. They didn't always, but that's another story. When I hear or read about learning and development professionals struggling to get cooperation from their SMEs, their subject matter experts, I feel sorry for them because they are trapped in a development process that hasn't taken care of that from the very beginning. Now, when I first meet with the project steering team and they've deemed that this is a project that we should indeed do, when they've decided not to kill it, we review the plan and the human resources required and then get names named. And we lock in to a hard schedule. If the L&D is worth doing to these kinds of stakeholders, then it's worth getting it done on time and on budget. And I put the onus on the project steering team members to handpick and share the names of the resources that they're going to lend to our efforts, which is really their effort as we're doing this on their behalf. There were times when one project steering team member would chide a fellow project steering team member for not giving the best people into our efforts, because they were doing that. Now, of course, you don't go through all of this rigmarole setting up project steering teams and having formal gate review meetings on projects addressing low stakes performance or projects that are addressing medium stakes performance. You do this for projects addressing high stakes performance, where the risks and or rewards to the organization and to the stakeholders are high, are significant. Personally, I'm not even sure that L&D resources should be working on anything other than high-stakes performance. I'd focus on those and leave the rest to informal learning, unstructured OJT. But that's just me. Now, as I wrap this up, please remember one of my sayings: adopt what you can and adapt the rest. This has worked very well for me in how I went about conducting my projects as a consultant. Perhaps there are things in these methods and practices that you can adopt and embrace and use as is, or that you can adapt and modify them in some way to help them fit your needs in your context. Always be ready to adopt or adapt as appropriate. One size seldom fits all, if ever. I hope this has been helpful to you in your development journey as an L&D professional focused on performance improvement for the learners as performers back on the job. Thank you.